Good morning. This is David Unsworth, host of the PanAm Post English podcast. Today I'll be speaking with Yael Ossowski about this weekend's Catalonian independence referendum. Yael is a senior development officer at Students for Liberty, deputy director at the Consumer Choice Center, and a contributor to the Washington Examiner, where he recently penned an op-ed about the independence movement. Yael, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me on, David. A pleasure.
I enjoyed very much reading your recent op-ed in the Examiner. The first thing that comes to mind, what the entire world is probably thinking here, did Rajoy make a huge mistake here by sending in the Guardia CVL to attempt to shut down this referendum?
I think it was definitely a huge show of force. If you've been paying attention to this whole kind of rigmarole between the separatists in Catalonia and the central government in Madrid, however, you know that this is kind of the ordinary way of doing things. Spain is very well known. We have to think that it's only a few decades back that Spain was still mired in dictatorship. So it does have a history of violence, particularly in the political arena. But in terms of the Catalonian and Madrid standoff, you know, it's basically been about 2 to 3 years that you've had very forceful interventions from typically these kind of agents in the ordinary kind of Catalonian agencies. You've had circumstances where police officers have gone into some of the regional governmental offices in Catalonia and beginning to cut telephone lines and cut internet lines. I mean, this kind of stuff has been going on in the background. It's been kind of passive-aggressive, but really this was the largest show of force that we've ever seen, even to where they unloaded an entire cruise ship, you know, and had thousands of officers that they just kind of unloaded on the region, which is not good for optics. So that was definitely a ding on Rajoy's part.
We often hear about, this is something actually we often hear in the United States, about to what extent is it true that one region pays more to a federal government than they receive back in tax benefits? To what extent is it true that Catalonia pays more to the government in Madrid than it receives back in benefits?
If you look at it in absolute terms, you can see that Catalonia does send about 10 billion euros, about $12 billion, to Madrid more than they receive. In many other regions of Spain, this is the complete opposite, and it's definitely true that Catalonia is one of the most productive, and obviously because of tourism, it is one of the largest economies of Spain. So that is very true. However, those who are on the kind of no side would also say that, you know, that's not actually an actual measurement. You know, there are a lot of other sort of immeasurable benefits that come from being in the Spanish state. A lot of things that you really just can't attach a dollar value to. This argument has been used a lot in various countries. The same happened in the UK during the independence referendum, in Quebec and Canada. So, you know, we can look at the GDP and kind of how much is going in taxes and how much is going back. It's never going to be uber accurate, but at least gives us a kind of indication that one region is very powerful and they do have the kind of economic means to kind of compete on their own. But I think that's still very much up for contention and likely will continue to be.
To what extent do you see this secessionist movement as related to economic issues, and to what extent it is about political and cultural identity? As you mentioned in your op-ed, Franco, in his 30-odd-year dictatorship, did a lot to try to stamp out the Catalonian identity and language, of course.
Yeah, I think in Catalonia it's very interesting. They speak Catalan. Obviously, young people are able to speak both, and most people are able to speak both. And for a long time, the language was repressed, and it was something that people were not taught in schools. They would actually be punished for speaking it in public. Again, this is something that was very similar in sort of colonial French Canada. Much the same happened there. But in Catalonia, they have this identity. They do have this kind of particular language and culture that they have been able to develop and build. You know, whether or not that is the case for independence is really up to them. It's not really for us to say, but what we can see is that, you know, this is a rough batch of people, you know, a couple of million people who speak their own language, who have their own tradition, they have their own sort of way of doing things, and for them that is enough for a lot of people to kind of say this is who we are, this is Catalonia, the big saying that you have is Catalunya no es España. So for a lot of people in Catalonia, it is a very distinct identity. Now, for the people who are voting, this will typically be the most important thing. For the people who are articulating this in terms of political office, such as the kind of president or anyone else, you need to make the more economic argument as well. This is something that if you've ever watched any European football, what we would call soccer in North America, the Football Club Barcelona, Barça, is very, very well known, and obviously this is a huge part of the culture. And sort of as a protest against the violence that had happened, they invited no fans to their game.
I saw that.
They've been very vociferous in kind of supporting the movement. It is kind of a cultural thing. Is that to say that is the absolute trigger for independence? No, not necessarily. But it's something very strong, which you probably did not have, nor could you really claim to have in Scotland in their attempted referendum in 2014.
If Catalonia were to secede, what would be the main economic implications for the rest of Spain?
Yeah, I think it's an iffy question. We really just don't have this experience in the modern realm. The only really, I guess, popular kind of referendum that granted independence so far has been South Sudan, from Sudan. And there you haven't really had, the kind of glowing evidence that independence works. They've been mired in civil war. There's still a lot of issues, a lot of arguments over oil rights. So, there is going to be a headache. As to Spain, it is 20% of the GDP that comes out of Catalonia. It's very important. And particularly because of the huge port there, and also because of the just hordes and hordes of tourists that come every year, they would definitely lose out. But I really think where the greatest impact would come would not necessarily just be from companies switching their addresses from Spain to the new nation of Catalonia. It's really just the uncertainty, because we don't really have a kind of experience of how to have a huge territory with millions of citizens become its own independent country in at least the kind of Western European world. We don't have any kind of examples of this, really. So for a lot of people, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty, and I think that's going to be the major kind of economic cost that you're going to have no matter what. That's not, again, an argument against independence. It's just something that we have to really realize might happen as a result.
The dominant political narrative of the past generation has been political integration spearheaded by the EU. The EU has to be looking down upon all this from Brussels and be rather dismayed, because this is exactly what they don't want. They want you can envision a European political future, and they don't want all these secessionist and independence movements. How does that play into this? What is the Catalonian perspective on the EU? Presumably they still want to remain in the European Union.
Yeah, this is one of the greater paradoxes of all of the modern independence movements across Europe. And again, that includes Scotland, but also the separatists in Belgium, to many who are in Italy and all the same. The idea that they want to be separate from the country that they're in now, the nation that they're in now, is a completely separate argument from whether or not they want to be in the European Union. Most of these countries and citizens of these countries and states understand the benefit that comes with being in a union like the EU. They're able to have access to the huge market. People are able to move between countries. You're able to sell products with no tariffs across the entire landscape of the European continent. So there's really a lot of benefit there. So it is always very strange when you have these independence movements that are kind of calling it up. But I think it'd be kind of a mistake to say, what is the point in independence if you still have this kind of European structure? Because the European Union as it exists now is not this supranational sort of overbearing institution that particularly the Brits would like us to believe. There's still a lot of laws that are made domestically. Of course, there's a lot of things that are handed down from Brussels that must be somehow adapted to the local context. But then again, most of the decisions can be made at the local level still. And by local, I mean national level. Most of these independence movements, everyone is still in favor of the EU. You don't see anyone kind of pushing back against that. Again, the paradox in the UK was that Scotland, which tried to go independent in 2004, is actually the place where people support the EU the most. So it's definitely something that is hard to kind of understand if you're not living in that context. But for most people in Spain, and particularly in Catalonia, they know that there's more benefit to being in the European Union than being without. You'd be outside of the club. If there were changes that would happen, and if there was independence declared, how the European Union would react, there's still a huge question mark there. There's been a lot of statements from Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the president of the European Commission, saying, oh, yes, we would accept them no matter what, while others saying, oh, no, it'll take 3 years and a huge application process. So really what's happening here is that no one really knows what to do. So everyone is just very confused, and I think much like in Brexit, we're just going to get a lot of mistruths and a lot of things thrown around that likely will not benefit the average citizen because, they're not having to spend all their time researching this. They're just going to read from the news, and if Brexit is any indication, most people are not going to be getting much good quality news. So I'm very happy that PanAm Post is covering this a little bit more and at least trying to analyze it from a good perspective.
We try. And for what would be a very small country like Catalonia, it would obviously be disastrous from a freedom of movement standpoint. You mentioned in your op-ed George Orwell's homage to Catalonia, which he wrote in the, I believe, what was that, 38, 39, something like that. In the Spanish Civil War, in the last stages of it, you had a situation where it was kind of Catalonia and northeastern Spain pitted against the rest of the country, and Catalonia, even though it's very economically powerful, has long kind of been a bastion of left-leaning political thought, say socialism. So how does this work in Catalonia? You have a very economically powerful kind of a bastion of capitalism, but they also seem to be on the left end of the political spectrum in the Spanish political context.
Yeah, I think it's the same ailment that exists in most Western European countries that have long since been rich. And if we follow the mantra of the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, the idea is that they've gotten so rich and so wealthy that they've kind of forgotten the essentials of what makes an economy powerful. What makes free and private enterprise powerful, and how can we use that to our benefit? I think most people, instead of focusing on the actual work and the free exchange that's happening to create wealth, they actually focus more on capturing that and figuring out what's the best social program that we can come together with. So in terms of what Orwell would think today, it's a very different situation. And I think at that point in time, it was very uncertain what we were dealing with. There was a very, very kind of, you could say, left-wing socialistic paramilitary forces. You had a kind of more fascistic regime. You had this kind of huge battle that was very ideological, and in many ways, it's kind of scary to think about because this is something that happened and very much preceded the Second World War, which is the greatest humanitarian disaster that we've ever had. So as to what he'd say today, I'm not sure. I think Orwell's mantra is you should always try to support at least the little guy or the one that's going against the system or the grain the most. He likely would be standing with Catalonia today, but it's very uncertain. He didn't really mention too much about the Catalan identity and language in the book because it just was not as powerful of a force nor as potent of a force back then. So again, this new independence move that we have is really only possible because of many decades and years of re-education of many young Catalans, them relearning their language, taking up a lot of interest in their own history. So there's a lot that the educational system has done too for that.
And what was fascinating about Orwell's experience was that he got caught up in a war within a civil war between he was in a kind of a more Trotsky-aligned international brigade, I guess, and the majority of groups fighting the Spanish Civil War were Stalinists, and they actually started killing members of his international brigade, if I call correctly, which gave Orwell a lifelong hatred of Stalinism. How will this impact other secessionist and independence movements throughout the world? I mean, the first thing that comes to mind in the Spanish context would be País Vasco, which has had a long and at many times violent independence movement. I guess the only other thing comes to mind in Europe by way of a referendum was the Montenegrin secession from Serbia, which I was talking to Slobodan Franeta about recently. What is going to go on in País Vasco?
Yeah, I think for that, you don't have the kind of huge amount of societal infrastructure in Basco that you do have in a place like Catalonia. So I'm not really sure. Maybe there will be kind of they'll try to get a resurgence, but the area was plagued by way too much violence and terrorism, and there's just still a lot of baggage that comes with that. Catalonia was very free from that. And again, these aren't the only regions that have experienced this. In my own home province of Quebec, which sought independence in both 1980 and 1995 in 2 referenda, the last one which lost by just 0.1%, by the way, there was also a lot of violence. There was a terrorist group that really was wreaking havoc across Canada, and really we saw a very, very forceful hand of then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau sending in troops to Montreal, and this is something that was a huge crisis at the time in Canada. If you look at Canada today, Quebec is actually freer than it's ever been. It's actually more economically wealthy than it's ever been, and that was really because of the decentralization that happened after the second referendum. Canada was able to really keep that conversation or that spirit and that fervor. They kept it pretty low and tranquil, and now the independence party in Quebec called the Parti Québécois, they're losing a lot of supporters. They're now like 3rd or 4th place in the polls. The kind of thirst for independence doesn't exist as much because Canada has proven that if you just allow regions more autonomy without necessarily separating them from the country, people can be better off. Once there was a lot of stability in Quebec, that actually was the message to a lot of young people.
Do you think that would be sufficient for the leaders of the Catalonian independence movement? Would granting them a much greater degree of political and economic autonomy lead them to set aside their demands for a complete political break?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the thing that we have to realize here is that there are a lot of questions that have been raised. They're not super illegitimate about the referendum itself, how it was held, the number of people who attended. Look, there's never going to be any situation where, particularly in continental Europe, that a referendum is going to be accepted by the central authority. It's just not something that's really going to happen. It's very strange. I think the Anglosphere countries, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, these are places that are used to popular referenda and accept them. And there is a mechanism to trigger these. In continental Europe, they don't really exist. In terms of that, for a lot of young Catalans especially, there was a huge, much like after Brexit, a huge kind of show of force of people out in the streets who are protesting against the vote. So is autonomy going to be the answer? In the long term, I say so, yes. But there's still a lot of just kind of introspection that has to happen on the part of the Catalans and the Catalonians. Yes, it is true that the referendum is not a 100% stamped, verified, provable referendum in terms of Spanish law. But then again, you don't really have that mechanism. So they really need to figure out what is it that people desire. And I think right now, the Prime Minister, the President does not have all of the collective will of the Catalan people. So he really needs to figure it out. And of course, I don't have the answer. I don't think he has the answer either. So whether it's a kind of new election or a kind of other mini referendum, who knows? But I think granting autonomy in the long term for Spain will end up being much more beneficial, will keep the country together, and in the case of Canada, really provide for a lot of great economic growth.
Now, to play the devil's advocate here, you and I and many of our readers at the PanAm Post are going to agree that if a certain region wants to secede and there is the political will for that and they have a democratic election to do it, that they should be allowed to do that. But this is a very, very dangerous idea, and it's the first thing that comes to mind is southeastern Ukraine, specifically these two regions of Luhansk and Donetsk. And obviously what happened a couple of years back in the Crimea, where Russia annexed it and the world basically just sat on their hands. This is like playing with fire here, because what's your take on this as it plays into the Ukraine situation? Because these are mostly Russian speakers, and many of them seem more loyal to the Moscow government than they do to the Kiev-based government. What would happen if, say, Luhansk and Donetsk say, well, Catalonia did it, we want to do this too?
Well, if we had to go back and kind of the historical narrative, all of this really started at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. That's the end of the First World War, and basically the largest world empires crumbled at that point in time. Austria-Hungary was gone, the Ottoman Empire was gone, the kind of mass buildup of Germany was then disintegrated, and what you had then was a drawing up of maps by just a few diplomats and leaders, among them Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the U.S. And from that, you had many, many years of issues and problems and wars and ethnic conflicts. And once all that was not settled, but at least arbitrated enough to where the borders are today, we have to imagine the last 60 years, there have been 100 new countries created. And that's come about through sometimes very peaceful dissolution, such as in Czechoslovakia, that is now Czech Republic and Slovakia, but also sometimes a lot of violence. So what it means whenever you have any kind of country in today's age that would like to kind of separate, there's a lot of weight behind that. In the cases of Crimea and the eastern parts of Ukraine, this is one where the media really let us down. It was very difficult to understand what was going on. The only good reports that we ever got were, let's say, from Vice. They were doing reports right there in the streets. When you have a kind of individual power that's waiting at the border with a military and guns, it's very different. It's much like in the Mexican-American War, where U.S. troops are kind of sitting there at the border fomenting internal division within Mexico, and then you have the invasion in 1846. It's always going to be very different when you have a foreign military or foreign army waiting at your borders, or waiting to just pounce on the opportunity. So I think it's something that we have to be aware of. You do have the right as a country to exist according to all the UN documents and charters that whatever it is, 192 countries have agreed to. So that's just something that we're going to have to try to arbitrate, whether it be through popular referenda, whether it be through some kind of constitutional governmental change. It's something that at least we have to keep out for. We have to keep informing people about it and at least talking about it, so that we talk about the history, we talk about the implications, and what this could mean if you allow a country to go free, or if you as a nation aim to go free. I think that's very important.
That's an interesting parallel there with the Mexican-American War in 1846. We've been speaking today with Yael Ossowski about the Catalonian independence movement. Yael, thank you so much for being with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Thanks to you and PanAm Post.